In this data set, we'll be talking about cleaning your data. Before your data is ready for modeling or analysis, we'll want to make sure that it's clean and ready to go. Here are some techniques that you can use to avoid any glaring errors in your data set. The first is to check the data values. For continuous variables, you can look at things like the min, the max, and the average to find values that don't make sense. They could be typos, they could be outliers, but they're all things that you can go ahead and fix before you build the model. Here for age, we can see a min of 18, a max of 650, and an average of 36. When we're looking at the max value, that might be a lot higher than we expect. We could see that maybe someone just created a typo. Instead of 65, they typed an extra 0 there. And we can go back to our data set to see if there are any other values that might not fit with the pattern we're expecting. For binary variables, we would first cleanse yeses and nos or y's or n's to be ones and zeros. That will make it really easy for us to analyze our binary variables. Next, if we look at the average value for any of those binaries, we can see the percentage of the population with that characteristic. We can check that against our intuition or what we know about our data set just to make sure that things are kind of lining up. So the variable we have here is a new customer flag, and we can see that 75% of our population has that flag. If we're working with a data set that we think should mostly be new customers, it looks like everything is checking out. But if we were thinking that this data set was customers who had a little bit of tenure, that would tell us maybe we should go back to the data set and double check things. Checking data values for categorical variables is pretty similar. In this case, we're looking at each of the different categories and we're counting the number of values that show up in that category. So we're looking for categories that maybe aren't used so much. This can help us find misspellings and overlap between categories. If we ignore the category column below and just focus on the count, we can see that some of those numbers look a little bit different. So we can see the 1, and when we look over at the category, the value entered is March. If we look at the other values, they all seem to be days of the week, so that might be telling us that maybe something from another column slipped in over here. If we scroll down a little bit, we can see the count of 5, which corresponds to a Thursday that seems to be spelled incorrectly. So that's a quick way to find two different kinds of errors in our data set. Whenever we're working with codes or even categorical variables, there are a few things to be aware of that are common issues that our customers have run into. Codes can become stale or obsolete. If you have a program and you discontinue that program, that particular code will become stale. Just something to be aware of in your data set. It doesn't necessarily mean that you can't use it. It might mean that you want to update it, but you'll just want to be aware of it and accommodating when you're ready to actually do an analysis. Sometimes codes can mean the same thing. So in the example on the right, we have a value for NH at the very top. And then later on, we have a value of New Hampshire. So those probably mean the same thing in our data set. And we just want to make sure that we're matching everything up and it all looks clean and uniform. Codes can be added year after year, so new codes can be introduced to your data set. Sometimes those new codes are just variations of old codes, but you'll just want to be aware of what codes were prevalent during which time because you'll be working with historical data. Codes can contain typos, so it's always good to check the number of values in your data set for each code to find codes that might be misspelled or mistyped. Codes can also be subsets of other codes. So again, if we look at the example on the right, the value at the very bottom is New England, which maybe doesn't fit with the states that we see above it. So those states might be subsets of the New England code, but it's something that we'll want to be aware of. We might want to create a new variable, maybe that represents region instead of state. But in any case, we'll want to make sure that the values within each column are uniform. Additionally, we'll want to avoid duplicates. So you'll want to dedupe your data set. Any duplicated record that you have gives that data twice the predictive power. So that record appearing more than once in your data set can really impact the model. In this case, you can see we have first names and last names, and we can see in orange there are a few that are highlighted that came up a couple of times. So Ringo Starr just keeps ending up in our data set. So we would want to remove any duplicates, so we just had one entry for Ringo Starr. Another thing we might want to do to expand our data set is to create additional variables. This is another place you can get super creative with any data that you might have on hand. We have two examples here. The first one is a pretty traditional variable creation. We're just doing a quick mathematical operation to get revenue minus expenses equals profit. But that is a new column that we can add to our data set. The second example is looking at different members within our database and their zip codes. From their zip codes, we can calculate the number of miles to a particular zip code, like our museum zip code, and use that as a new variable in our data set. So depending on the software that you're using in order to build out these new variables, you can get really simple variable creations into very complex variable creations. But generally speaking, you do want to add new variables to your data set in order to slice it different ways and explore things that you might not have noticed before. Another example of a time you would create new variables is when you're utilizing date fields. So dates can't be directly used in a predictive model. Generally speaking, you'll want to create a relational variable that looks at different dates. So it calculates maybe the time between days or the days since a particular event. In that case, you're going to be creating a new variable. So the example we have here is when a customer signs up for a reward program, when their first purchase was, and then the number of days to their first purchase. So the reward sign up and the first purchase might not be very useful to a model, but knowing the number of days between those two dates could be very useful. So any kind of information that we can glean from the date fields, we'll definitely want to try to extract, but generally speaking, we won't be able to use the dates themselves. Finally, we'll want to be aware of missing values. Missing values become increasingly important while you're analyzing your data as your software package tries to decide how to best fill them in. So anytime you can decide how you might want to fill your missings is usually better than leaving it to the average or setting everything to 0. Those are two very common ways to fill in missings, but if you have a way of explaining missings within your data set, sometimes that is the better way to go. Another thing worth doing is looking at your missing values and trying to find possible explanations. So in the example below, for each student, we have SAT score and ACT score as a column. We can see that we're missing about half of the ACTs and about half of the SATs. But we can also see that each time a student has an SAT score, they don't have an ACT score. That might just be telling us that those students are submitting either one or the other. So a missing value maybe shouldn't be set to the average there. Maybe we should try to find a way to combine those columns or to flag that we have that information for each individual. So just looking at the data set and kind of trying to get a feel for maybe why a variable might be missing will go a long way. And we'll talk about that a little bit later in the series.